Houndish here, and today I wanted to jump in and talk about some Destiny 2 stuff. Of course, we've heard from Bungie that they're making their way back into the studio, and we're going to hear news soon. And we have a couple more specifics on that, which I want to touch on. I also wanted to talk about Destiny 2's player population drop-off and some interesting facts about that. Some new listings for jobs at Bungie, which are kind of interesting. Some insights about raid design from some of the guys at Bungie, and a couple of other things, so it will be a bit of a mixed bag, this one, but I think it's going to be an interesting one. So, of course, we've heard that Bungie will be making some updates in early 2018, and we now have a couple more specifics about precisely what's going to be happening. So firstly, Bungie did post a quick blog update saying Happy New Year. The dawning festivities thaw to a close on January 9th, so that'll be on next week's reset. You still have time to make a snowball and tag your best friend or your most dreaded strike boss, but there is a new calendar on the wall, and we're already angling to fill it with a new season of rituals and rewards that will be available to all. One by one, our teammates are returning to the studio. We'll tell you about our plans for the next update to Destiny 2 in the next This Week at Bungie blog address on January 11th. So the first This Week at Bungie blog post will come next Thursday, January 11th, and they've said that we will hear about their plans for the next update to Destiny. So this is good to hear. I was kind of concerned, that we would have to wait until next week and then we'd get, a fairly generic blog post saying that we'll be back next week with more information. You know how it goes. Also, Christopher Barrett did tweet, working on a development update for everyone next week, lots of good info to share. Deej also tweeted, had my first of many meetings with Chris Barrett today to talk about how we'll follow up on these promises. That conversation will continue next week once the community partners are back in the saddle, and it will include all of you soon after. And he actually tweeted in reference to Christopher Barrett's Eververse tweet, where they said they'd heard the feedback. So I just wanted to point out that they are directly targeting some specific subjects, and on January 11th they say that they'll break down details about the next actual update to the game. So that is really positive. I'm glad that we'll get that next week. On top of this as well, we can also expect to hear about Faction Rally and Iron Banner. So hopefully next week we'll make another step onto a much more positive path forward. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they tackle some of these issues. Moving on though, I wanted to talk about a Reddit post by Steve the Impact. And he's actually done quite a lot of in-depth research into the Destiny 2 player population. So there's a lot of maths involved. It's been using the API to actually do this. And because of the way the data is collected, this is a sample size of around about 10% of the total population, and these are the results. So the total player count dropped from 1.3 million to 321,000 from launch up until the end of the year, which is the 31st of December. So of course, this being 10%, you're looking at least 10 or 11 million players, dropping down to roughly 3 million players across all of the platforms for the game. And that 10% on individual platforms such as PS4 is 712,000 to 158,000, for Xbox 594,000 to 127,000, and for PC 194,000 to just 35,000. And that's a drop of 81.5% in the player base. This is also represented if you look at Destiny Tracker's stats for the game. For example, yesterday there were 252,000 players in Crucible and 1.1 million players in PvE content. And Destiny Tracker has tracked 8.1 million players in total, but of course the way that this data is collected means that there are going to be discrepancies between different platforms and different systems that are doing it. So like I said, these aren't 100% accurate, but they don't really have to be in order to get the message across, do they? The drop-off is, very significant with the game, and obviously you're going to see a mass audience move away from any title that's released. So, through September, October, November especially, those are the periods of time where you really expect to see that drop-off as people who, just want to run the campaign and things like that kind of move away. But obviously the real concerning factor is that right up until the end of 2017 and then the days in 2018 that we've had so far, we're seeing those numbers continue to decline. In fact, I said 252 Crucible players tracked for yesterday. That's actually up because Trials of the Nine was up as well. And some of the days before that, I remember seeing, 220,000, 210. So I just wanted to break that information down for you guys. Obviously, it's been a subject of conversation already, but there is just a quick update on, roughly where we're at. And it definitely shows shows how Bungie have a lot of work to do regarding, the progression systems and the stickiness of the game, but that of course is stuff that we already know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts though in the comment section. Next though, I wanted to point out that Bungie are looking for a new head of narrative development. So this is actually a management focused position, so it's essentially someone to manage the teams that do the narrative work for the game. And it's just worth pointing out, there've been a lot of Reddit posts about this, people saying, are they going to change direction on the story again and all of these kind of things. This isn't necessarily super significant in that sense. You've got to remember though that the amount of content Bungie have to produce is incredibly substantial. Right now there's the potential that they're still working on elements of the second DLC for Destiny. If there's going to be any kind of huge update in September, which I really hope there will be, then of course they'll be working on that. And there are going to be people inside of the studio that are already being kind of completely moved away onto other much more long-term things, Destiny 3 potentially. And of course this is all happening at a time where there is a ton of feedback about Destiny, so they have to be incredibly sensitive that things they're beginning development of now for in 2 or 3 years time are being developed in a way which supports the emerging direction for this game. So point being, there's a lot of stuff going on at Bungie. That's why we're seeing jobs like this popping up. It doesn't necessarily mean anything significant for the immediate future of Destiny. Next though, I wanted to point out some tweets from Joe Blackburn, who's actually the Destiny raid team lead at Bungie. There are some interesting points here about raid boss designs and the kind of encounters. So he said, from time to time I read fair criticisms on why raid fights only encourage you to shoot the boss in short bursts instead of all the time. So he said, we actually do prototype fights like this, but generally they all come back to one core issue. It's not super fun to shoot the same target over and over in most FPS games. But DPS races in WoW are still pretty fun, right? I'd argue that the fun in an action bar RPG is highly geared to what happens without ever changing my target. Here's an example. And he actually posted this image which shows, how a traditional MMO boss DPS section would work. He referred to World of Warcraft before, and then a sequence of 15 actions in a Destiny boss DPS section, and you could see that it's much more basic. You've got throw grenade, fire sniper 6 times, reload, fire sniper 6 times, reload. And he said a big part of engagement in action bar RPGs is how skilled I am at pressing the right buttons on the keyboard at the right second. In a shooter, I basically press the same button over and over again once I have a target. The fun and skill in most shooters I play comes back to my ability to track my camera on targets and those enemies forcing me to reposition my character. When I do shoot something, I want it to feel awesome. I want to feel the weight of the projectiles against the target in this high fidelity physics simulation game. If I can't watch something explode instantly with my sunshot, I'm hoping it at least gets staggered. So if we can't make a fight that's a boss dying in one hit, or just 6 guardians in a room pressing the same button for 4 minutes, chain staggering a single dude, what can we do? And now that the player only has a few seconds to shoot the boss, all that time matters. Instead of being reminded that they just keep pressing fire, they are now desperately trying to get every possible grenade, super class ability and precision shot in before time expires. I'm still very excited about the challenge of making a fight with 6 guardians and 1 boss alone in a room with no ads and no wrong time to shoot the boss, but when we do, I want you guys to love it. So it's a pretty interesting insight into, some of the gameplay design there, and it is pretty understandable. Because Destiny is an action game, you need that moment where the action actually accumulates to something, and really that is what they do with bosses in Destiny generally. You have that kind of warm-up period, where you're taking down ads and preparing to actually engage a target, collecting ammo, getting your abilities ready and everything like that, and then it comes down to that moment where you have that burst of action, which is also kind of requiring quite a lot of focus. You want to hit all of your shots, you want to make sure that your DPS is as optimal as possible, and it definitely adds to that frenetic game that Destiny is. And obviously there would be a big challenge in creating a fun encounter where you just continuously attack something, and in certain parts of the game of course they do that, but they tend to give you abilities. Even really basic encounters like earning your subclasses in the game, those are the moments where they want you to just kind of go insane, and the right amount of that obviously is also fun. So it's really interesting. That's one of the really intriguing parts about Destiny and making an action game like Destiny, because of course Destiny games have always been very fun to actually play. The element of actually using the sandbox in Destiny games is really cool. A couple of interesting things I wanted to point out. Destiny the game Reddit does have their This Week in DTG history. It was this week a year ago that we got that concept teaser poster for Destiny 2 from a fan. So Elad04 actually posted this image with the stranger right there. It's time to explain. And obviously I can remember people getting really hyped about this. It was a really cool moment. You can see it's got 17,000 views. It was a pretty popular image. So it was a year ago that happened. There's also another one from a year ago by Obersword, who actually said the 2 L3 weapon balance patches a year model is not working. And it's really interesting because, of course, we haven't really had any major sandbox tune into Destiny 2 so far. So really, in terms of the sandbox front to the game, nothing is changing over time that much at the minute. And I'm not just complaining, but, you know, I'd just like to see Bungie perhaps take a little bit of a different approach as opposed to kind of making the game balanced all the time. How about just some sandbox patches that switch things up, you know, buff some abilities that aren't looking too great, some weapons that aren't doing too great. I feel like we can have a bit more of a risky approach to sandbox design in Destiny. Of course, I'm not a designer. I have essentially no clue, but I know when I'm having fun, you know, mayhem, right? That's a really fun moment in the Crucible. I just love to see things spiced up a little bit. So just a random interesting point anyway. Also, look at this. The Toasty Tony posted on Reddit, pretty interesting image. In this Crucible match, at the end, he got an exotic engram, as well as a Wardcliff coil, and a Masterwork Better Devils. Look at that for a good job. So of course, the engram is just luck. I guess so is the Better Devils. And then of course, I believe that's an Eververse boon that allowed them to get the Wardcliff coil, and that's why it's just straight up dropping in the match. I'd absolutely love to get a drop like that at the end of the Crucible match. It'd be pretty exciting. But anyway, guys, a very random roundup of stuff in this video. I'm sorry if it's ended up being a little bit longer than usual, but I really like doing videos like this, you know. They're not like strictly news videos all the time, but being able to touch on a whole bunch of different, you know, subjects and things that are going on in the community or between the developers and the community, I find it really interesting. It's one of the elements of the game and, you know, the whole thing around Destiny, which is still really vibrant. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you have, a like is very much appreciated. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit subscribe to see more Destiny 2 content. For now though, I hope you have an awesome day.